Dobry din and welcome to Odessa Mama for today's live stream. Another fantastic day. I put my camera in the shade so it doesn't overheat my iPhone since I haven't on the last live stream. And today's discussion is going to be about how the tide of the war has turned and how Ukraine is winning. I made a prediction back after 3 weeks of the 2022 Russian invasion. I was in Budapest when I made it. I'd already come to that conclusion a week earlier. And my prediction was that Russia had lost and Ukraine had won or would win this war. And I was basing that on the objectives, strategic objectives of both sides at that point. And so at that point in 2022, Ukraine's strategic objective was to survive as a state. They were not at that point thinking of recapturing all the occupied territory that Russia had before 2014. It's about 8% of Ukrainian territory, so Crimea and some parts of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast in the east of Ukraine. They weren't looking for compensation. They weren't looking for a war crimes tribunal. They were simply looking to survive. Those aims were then updated by Zelensky later that year in 2022 after Ukraine had liberated Kharkiv Oblast and Kherson, the city. And obviously, the Battle of Kiev had been won as well pretty soon after the invasion, whatever it was, a couple months after the invasion. If we look at the Russian side, they have had the same strategic objectives which Vladimir Putin, their leader, outlined a few days before the invasion in 2022. So he used these euphemisms for denazification. That just basically means getting rid of anyone who's anti-Russian, right? Just putting in a puppet government, somehow removing, whether that's killing or imprisoning or deporting anyone who opposes Russian rule. They had demilitarization, which was basically there wouldn't be a Ukrainian military unless, of course, it was under Russian control. So maybe there would be a rump Ukraine somewhere, but it couldn't have a military. And the list goes on. The root causes, they call them, basically that Ukraine can never join NATO and some other things that they sometimes continue to raise up. But if you look at what they've actually achieved since 2022, if you look at the territory they control, that was about 8%. They now control still under 20% of Ukrainian territory. At the high watermark was around 25% because they control large parts of Kharkiv Oblast, city of Kherson, and parts of Kyiv and other oblasts in the north. And now they occupy, since 2022, they're taking the city of Mariupol, which is a significant city. They completely sacked it, destroyed it. At the time, so it's not really, and I guess looted it. So it's now going to be a big expense to renovate that city. If I don't think Russia's ever planning to do that, but presumably if it's liberated, the Ukrainians will. And they took some other smaller regional cities, like the actually one intact, which is Melitopol, where I've been once. I think it's got population pre-war of a little bit over 100,000 people. Maybe it's a bit bigger than that. Other than that, they've just taken territory. They destroyed most of the cities on the way, and they control this land bridge which connects Russia, the jure Russia proper, all the way down to occupied Crimea. So that is a strategic objective. They had a physical bridge that had already built from Russia to Crimea, but the effectiveness of that land bridge has now been called into question because Ukraine has increased its drone capability to basically attack any military vehicles going up and down that section of the highway along the Sea of Azov. So it is currently questionable how valuable that is a strategic achievement, because at the moment during this war, they can't actually do very much with it safely, and it's only getting worse and worse for them. So really, Russia has achieved very little, and they're in danger of effectively losing their only real strategic achievements since 2022. They have spent huge amount of money. Their economy is in the doldrums. They're in a recession. It's only getting worse and worse for their economy, and they're going to have more economic retrenchment at home. They've blown through most of their Soviet era munitions and vehicles. They're now asking the Taliban of Afghanistan to send those military vehicles the Soviets left behind. And that must be about 40 years ago that they evacuated. So those vehicles are a minimum 40 years old, but that's how desperate they are to get their hands on. Of course, they do have production to produce new stuff, but it's not that much. And they go through so many of this material every month that's harder and harder for them to keep up with that. It's very hard for them to actually even use vehicles at the moment. On top of that, they have a casualty rate that is at this stage has ballooned past 1 million. That is missing in action, wounded in action, and killed in action. It's ballooned past it, and the death toll is extremely high at the moment, even according to the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio recently. He was talking about how it's 5-1 in terms of the killed in action on the Russian side versus killed in action on the Ukrainian side. And that mirrors just how deadly these FPV drones are. Not too many of the soldiers, because of the tactics of Russia, also to use these infiltration tactics where they send soldiers forward in smaller groups or on their own to actually be evacuated if they are injured. It's extremely different. Many more perish than would be normally expected. So they find themselves in this position where they're not even making really any headway on the battlefield. They are a little bit still in the Donbas area around Konstantinivka. It is the first city in the line. I think there's like 5 cities, if I remember correctly, in this fortress belt. And the Russian Federation would need to take all 5 of those in order to have a strategic achievement, which is capturing the Donbas region, where maybe Putin could say, "Oh, I achieved something with this war, even if it's at ridiculously high cost." Thing is, at the current rate of progress, it's going to be at least 5 years before they manage to capture the 5 fortresses. They're probably taking about 1 year, and at huge cost. And it is not clear what kind of economic and manpower situation they're going to be in if they keep going that way, because so far, since the autumn of 2022, when they had their only mobilization of 300,000 soldiers, Vladimir Putin has avoided going for another mobilization. So he would be for sure forced into doing that if he wanted to prolong the war for another 5 years in order to have the strategic achievement. So you can see that even if the Ukrainians stay static, which is not the case, the Ukrainians have been improving all the time, Russia would find it extremely difficult to get any sort of strategic position that would be considered any sort of achievement. And we're not even talking about them worth all the loss of life and treasure and political problems that is caused for the Russian Federation and people in Moscow and St. Petersburg, because people have said that currently don't really seem to matter too much in the Russian political calculation. Now, on the Ukrainian side, so we're talking about how Ukraine is winning. They recaptured a lot of territory in 2022, had many victories over the Russian side, and there was a lot of expectation in 2023 that they would have a summer offensive and they would continue to advance all the way down to Sivasov. That didn't happen. They managed to advance, but they had significant losses and it fell short of what was expected. Personally, I don't think the Biden administration, looking at the evidence, really wanted them to succeed. Their idea was to create this impasse for as long as it takes. Could be decades as far as the Biden administration was concerned. They wanted to avoid what's known as escalation, i.e., Russia doing something dramatic in response to losing. And they did not give Ukraine enough firepower or the permission even to use the munitions that they were giving to the full extent that would have been necessary in order to achieve. I think they thought they'd go further, but after that setback, the Ukrainians replaced the commander in chief. Zaluzhny was replaced by Syrskyi, and there was a new policy, which was to prepare and implement a war of attrition, would then become not just about maneuver warfare on the front lines, because the Russians have built Surovikin, who've been one of the Russian commanders before he was removed around the time of the Prigozhin mutiny. He built these defensive lines, and with the technology and strategy that the Ukrainians had at the time, it was not possible to penetrate those. So we've had this policy by Ukraine of trying to extract huge losses from the Russian side in exchange for territory. So they've been slowly moving back, or you can say the Russians have fought their way in, and they have taken many towns like Bakhmut, Obviously, the started Donetsk, wasn't that another one? Or several of the Donetsk. And we had some others that were taken Pokrovsk, for example, along the way, but none of those cities was particularly important in the broader scheme of things. Obviously, it's important to people who live there because their cities got completely flattened by the Russian advance. They basically destroyed almost every building on their way. So we have, you can hear air alert at the moment. Hopefully, it has to cut off the audio. He didn't do it last time, so I'm just going to assume that you can still hear me for now. But I guess you won't. You maybe put a one if you're watching, and that you can hear me. That will be enough. So that has been the strategy. The Russians are to believe that they would win this war of attrition. Russia big, Ukraine small, relatively speaking. However, they have gotten to the point where they don't have the resources currently to make any sort of strategic achievement with this current policy in a war of attrition, wearing each other down because the economy is in trouble. They've blown through the Soviet era stockpiles, they're not producing enough to replace it, and manpower has just gone through so much. They now lose more soldiers than they're able to recruit every month. So that is clearly, if you look at a war of attrition, in spite of the losses by the Ukrainians, it is now so much lower than the losses by the Russians. Ukraine also has European allies because the new Trump administration doesn't give any aid and sells weapons directly to Ukraine through the European allies. Nonetheless, but they do. Trump administration does provide some intel. Nonetheless, the European allies have stepped up place. They've guaranteed Ukraine's financing for another 2 years. They are working with them to buy weapons from the Americans or supply their own weapons. Now we see the Gripen, as we call them in English, Swedish fighter jets. I think it's pronounced some other way, Gripen maybe in Swedish, that are coming along. There's going to be there are French jets going to be in the Air Force, so they're less and less reliant. They're in a phase of probably swapping out a lot of that U.S. equipment in reality for European alternatives that will take several years to complete. But also, Ukraine has ramped up its domestic production. If you think back to 2024 and the US presidential election, when there was that time where US Congress blocked any more aid that Biden could send, it was very important that it finally got through because that bought enough time for Ukraine to then develop alternatives internally. Now, Ukraine is a world leader in anti-drone defense. So these Shahed drones that come in, Ukraine has, since around November, because that's the first time I heard them, have these drone interceptors. And you saw in the war in the Middle East that Ukraine was effectively exporting that technology to countries in the Middle East and to the Israelis, but the Americans probably as well, because they are the world leaders at shooting down that type of drone. Now, here, I can say in Ukraine, officially they say they knocked down 95% of the incoming kamikaze drones. When I observe the air defense in action, I can say it's very high. I can't say if it's 95% or 90% or 99%, but it's most of them are now shut down. Of course, you have the debris. Of course, you have the percentage gets through, but it has transformed that dynamic. Now we see the Ukrainians have been dependent on these Patriot interceptor missiles for ballistic missiles coming in from the Russians. Ukraine has now tested an alternative that they say is a lot cheaper. So Ukraine, domestic production, it's last time I checked, it was over 40% of the munitions are used, but you can actually domestically produce. It's probably a lot higher than that by now, and it's probably the majority. And if they're going to be able to produce the company's Firepoint interceptor drones or interceptors for ballistic missiles, then we're going to see probably a very similar scenario than we saw with these drone interceptors. That suddenly Ukraine is going to be a world leader because they're going to be able to produce them and scale it up. That they're probably going to be able to have enough. It might take a few months, hopefully by 2027, enough to shoot down whatever Russia is firing on any given day. Russia apparently has a stockpile of about 400, 500 missiles, and they're probably producing, I can't remember, if it's 100 per month, something in that ballpark, last time I checked as well. So you can see if they were to ramp it up to actually have, 500 to 1,000 of these interceptors to take out these Russian ballistic missiles, and if they had the same sort of shoot down rate as the drone interceptors, you're looking at a situation we go from, at the moment, Ukraine is going to shoot down 33% from what they say. So Maybe it's even lower, but they say 33%. Most of them do get through, it seems. If they can ramp that up to something similar to drones, you're talking about 95%. And Russia basically would then have to be producing like 5 or 6 times the rate of missiles, which they presumably don't have the capability for, in order to have the same effectiveness that they do now. So basically, they would limit that as a major threat. Of course, Russia would still, be a bit of cat and mouse. They will develop on their technology, but you see that Ukraine is now replacing this dependence on the U.S. Because in part because Trump withdrew it by not giving them aid, and also not supplying them with, or that's the same with the Biden administration, not supplying them with enough material. So you see that Ukraine is turning the tide through strategy and also technological development and its cooperation with its European allies. European allies are the ones that basically pay for Ukraine not to collapse, which is why Russia increasingly focuses its propaganda on trying to undermine the governments in the European Union or the United Kingdom that support Ukraine and it's what they want to win the war. So this is one of the tactics that they are employing to try and change that dynamic, because if they could cut off the aid to Ukraine, then presumably it would undermine the Ukrainian resistance and make it very hard for Ukraine to win this war. As they win, well, they've already achieved what the objectives were. I don't think they're really in question anymore. What they had in early 2022, which is fight the Ukrainian state. Whether they will retake all the currently occupied territory, put the Russian war criminals on trial, be compensated for the destruction, get all the children that Russia kidnapped back, we have to wait and see. That is really what this phase of the war going forward is all about, since the tide has turned, which is what I expected. It's what I predicted. I thought it would come earlier than it did. I thought it would be maybe not that the war would end in 2023, but we'd be on the path to that. And probably in 2024, by the end of 2024, we would have had a Ukrainian victory or some sort of near victory where there was some agreement and compromise, maybe over Crimea or something like that. Now, because of the decisions made, Ukraine, to a certain extent, has been in the past dependent a lot on this strategy, alliances with the United States and the Europeans, but increasingly it is more independent in its capability, mainly the financing. And obviously those weapons that the US gave at the time were important to the defense, and but they continue to buy and to support the Europeans. But they are producing more and more themselves or in joint ventures with European allies. So now it has become visible maybe that the tide has turned. I think the tide had turned probably after about 2 weeks. And we've just done this very long progress. When people look back to the Second World War, everyone thinks it's obvious that Germany was going to win in 1943. But they fought on until Hitler shot himself in his bunker and they were completely occupied and Berlin was destroyed, even though they should have been able to see they were on that losing path. So don't expect that Vladimir Putin's or the Russian leadership is going to suddenly start making good decisions and call a halt to the war. They may decide to risk more and more and fight on. Not indefinitely, because at a certain point they would just collapse. But we are on that trajectory. And the real question is how much territory will Ukraine reclaim overall, and what will be the consequences economically in terms of compensation, war crime tribunals, and other outlined objectives of the Ukrainian government. So we have seen it seep into the mainstream pretty recently. I've actually seen now more and more chatter about buying property here in Ukraine, something I've been talking about since last summer. I emphasize three things, mainly on my lifestyle channel. Investing in now everyone thinks that's super obvious because of what's happened in the Middle East, but I was saying it here last summer because there were so many representatives of European defense industry in the different defense industries here in both Odessa and in Kyiv. Agriculture is, Ukrainian agriculture is spread best for Europe. It's kind of a bit of a no-brainer to be investing in that. And then real estate, because of this war, it's kept the prices like here in Odessa lower, about the same as they were in 2021. And obviously, it's coming up on 5 years afterwards. So relative to price everywhere else, very good investment, especially now that this city is not in danger of being occupied or anything. So the trajectory after the war for Ukraine will be very positive economically. So you could say that you look at other countries like Poland, then this is like getting in like the 2000s in Poland or something like that as a kind of rough comparison. Prices have gone up in the west of Ukraine about 30%, up to about 30%, depending on the city, like Lviv, because people feel more secure there. A lot of Ukrainians move there. Same price level in Kiev, more or less. But if you go to cities closer to the front lines or to the border with the Russian Federation, they have dropped maybe 20, maybe 30%. I had a client who went to Zaporizhia. There was around the New Year, so I think it was still in December or maybe January, when the weather was not great. And we had a lot of problems with the energy because Russia blown up a lot of the energy infrastructure at the time. That's now being repaired and hopefully fortified for next winter. And just think about these ballistic missiles interceptors that will be, they are delivered in time for winter. It's probably not going to be fully delivered by then, but they've already tested. Then that would stop Russia actually blowing up the energy infrastructure to a certain extent. And they've already greatly reduced the Russians' capability to blow up the energy infrastructure with these kamikaze drones. Now that they've rolled out fully the drone interceptors, they had them already for part of the winter, as I said, in November. So, with respect to the real estate there, he was amazed by what was being offered at the price point. But of course, you weren't too far from the Russian forces. In that area in Zaporizhia, in the last month or so, Ukraine has been pushing back with some counterattacks. I wouldn't call it a full counteroffensive, pushing the Russians back a bit. So we will see what will happen in the next few months before the winter. There is a possibility that the Ukrainians will actually launch a 2026 summer offensive, more or less in the same area as the failed 2023 offensive. That would be the case if Ukraine figures out, with the assistance of new technological developments, in particular with respect to drones, a new military doctrine that will allow them to circumvent the Surovikin line and the Russian defenses. Something actually Zaluzhny, who's now the ambassador, he was actually, we spoke by video link to the Black Sea Security Forum last weekend. When he was commander in chief, I think it's when he resigned, he said, or maybe it was just beforehand, he published kind of an op-ed, I think, or some article where he said that, like in World War I, we're going to be in a state, not a stalemate, but an impasse, and it'll basically be a race to figure out new technology and new military doctrine in order to overwhelm the opponent. And that's something that, once it happens, can happen very quickly, like it did in World War I, where the German forces on the Western Front were rolled back very, very quickly by the Allied powers. I guess that was primarily the United Kingdom, France, US. So if we have that happening, and of course that's an unknown, it's a known unknown right now, then we could see before the end of summer an actual Ukrainian counteroffensive. And it would probably make more sense to have it in Zaporizhia. Of course, the Russians are going to be aware that that's a likely place to do it. Because if you look at the Donbass region, you look at the current strategy by Ukraine, which is one of attrition, then they actually want the Russians to keep advancing at huge cost in that area. It actually might be arguably in Ukraine's favor to slightly retreat, just ever so slowly, and keep Putin thinking that he can get to the strategic achievement, which is to capture the Donbass, because that would have strategic effect if he could point to, hey, I managed to capture all the Donbass and spin a propaganda narrative around it. We saved all the people of Donbass. And then suddenly say the war is over, we're stopping the fighting. Because at least he has something to show for it. At the moment, he doesn't have anything. He has the land bridge. But I mean, I don't think enough people in Russia really care about the land bridge. It's also not really that useful right now because, as I said, the Ukrainians can basically attack all the vehicles, military vehicles along that, supply vehicles. And also the Kerch Bridge, it's actually a weaker position because they can't, apparently at the moment, they're not really using the Kerch Bridge for supplying the military in Crimea because they think it's too unstable after the previous Ukrainian attacks on that bridge, which is an illegally constructed bridge as well, to boot. So that could be what will happen this summer. We will see some sort of attack there by the Ukrainians, and then Russians will advance really piecemeal at a very slow rate in the Donbass area, but at a rate that would probably take them 5 years, maybe longer, maybe a little bit shorter, actually achieve that strategic objective, which is not going to be soon enough for Vladimir Putin, judging by the state of play in the Russo-Ukrainian war. What would be the impact if the Ukrainians suddenly take back a large amount of territory? Strategically, they would aim to split that line corridor, completely cut off also on the map, and take back part of the highway, and then split the Russian force between Crimea, which then could be, or the parts leading down to Crimea, which then could be completely isolated. It would be very hard to resupply them. Ukrainians could then consider blowing up the rest of the bridge, the Kerch Bridge, which would basically mean the Russians would bring everything across by ferry. They can also interdict those. They have the sea drones, of course, as well, but they have to go a long way around. Plus, there's always a bit of cat and mouse. The Russians now apparently are figuring out better electronic warfare to divert either the Ukrainian aerial drones or the sea drones. We had a Ukrainian sea drone blow up in port of Constanța, Romania, after it was redirected by Russian electronic warfare. So, going to have a little bit of cat and mouse. However, if the Ukrainians could get to that strategic objective or operational objective to split the land corridor, then for sure Vladimir Putin has a big fat zero for this phase of the war since 2022, and he's going to be officially a loser, and that's going to be very obvious to anyone with half a brain cells to left in Russia that the whole thing is certifiably a complete train wreck, and they need to figure out of getting out of it, and that might involve removing Vladimir Putin for power at that stage. So I'm not expecting a popular uprising, expecting more a policy coup type situation, like think of the Prigozhin mutiny and someone trying to take him out and replace him when he looks extremely weak. Because he's already been humiliated a few times in the last month. We had Ukrainians hit the port of St. Petersburg earlier in the week, and a corvette, I think it was off Kronstadt Islands in the Gulf of Finland, I'm pretty sure, just whatever the body water is in front of St. Petersburg. On the morning of the opening of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, his economy is in a recession. He's thrown an economic forum for investors, and they can look out their window from their fancy hotel and see smoke billowing from the port. Not really going to reassure you about putting money into the Russian economy at the moment. Prior to that, he had to hold Donald Trump to implore him to request from Zelensky that he wouldn't strike his parade on May 9th. And then Zelensky published a letter basically saying, yes, I give you permission. Vladimir Ivanovich Putin, you can hold your parade, but just on Red Square, just in those coordinates. Again, a huge humiliation. And Russia tries to control the spread of information, but people still have VPN. A certain number of part of the population are reading and seeing what's going on. They can look out their window and see these drone attacks and think after 4 years, it doesn't look like they're winning, does it? So many of them are going to come to the conclusion that most of us who watch this channel have come to, that it's in fact the Ukrainians who are winning. If we can say anyone wins in a war, definitely they're the ones who are now on course to prevail. The real question is, what will the end game be? That was actually the slogan from the Black Sea Security Forum. It was end game question mark. So what is the end game? I interpreted when I saw it as, are we in the end game? But more and more it looks like that was prescient because it was only a week ago, and now I feel like we really are in that phase of this phase, at least this subphase of phase 2 of the Russo-Ukrainian war, the one that started in 2022. And the real question is whether Ukraine will have a complete victory as outlined with those objectives in 2022 by President Zelensky, or it will be some sort of compromise that probably won't last for the long time, to be frank, something like the Minsk III agreement where front lines are probably frozen. That is really the big question. But for sure, Russia is going to fail in its strategic objectives. And just as my opinion, just as a final comment, Igor Girkin, I love to quote him because he's a Russian ultranational horrible person, convicted of sensitive war crimes, terrible. He's part of the original occupation invasion of Ukraine in 2014 as part of the GRU. He's been saying that Putin is basically, I'm paraphrasing, a complete moron in terms of strategy and hasn't been making the right moves for many years. He sits in a Russian prison, not for being a war criminal, but for the crime of criticizing Vladimir Putin in public. But he hasn't fallen out a window. He's still alive. He hasn't been poisoned or anything yet, at least, which means he still has power and influence in the Russian Federation. He has said that even if Putin now goes for a mobilization. He says, too late. It's not going to change the course of the war. And he said last year that basically Russia had almost no chance, and basically a miracle if they managed to achieve their strategic objectives. More likely, the two scenarios that now we're really discussing: complete Ukrainian victory or some sort of messy Minsk III agreement, basically, to paraphrase, because we had Minsk 1 and 2 back in 2014 and 2015. That is the state of play. So maybe pass on this video to anyone that you know who's still questioning about the current trajectory of the war, the educational for them. This, the content from my channel comes out weeks, months before the mainstream finally figures it out that this is the reality on the ground here in Ukraine. That's why I relabeled this channel Inside Ukraine, because I'm actually here on the ground, so you can see exactly what's going on and get good analysis way before the rest of the media space catches up with it. So on this beautiful Saturday afternoon, we're going into evening because it's 6 o'clock here local time. I will bid you a very nice evening. Хорошего вечера. Доброго вечера, even in Ukrainian. I guess you can technically say хорошего вечера also in Ukrainian. That's normally the Russian greeting or salutation. And Slava Ukraini, Rom Slava, and most importantly, Do Peremohi, to victory. Ciao, ciao from Odessa, and chat soon.